By the environmental imaginary, I was sort of toying around with different notions. I thought about something along the lines of nature and the environment in Brazilian poetry and art. I wanted to get to something that would push beyond issues of representation, I guess. So what I want this to be a sort of very expansive notion. I wanted it to include the question of representation of specific landscapes, specific signs of nature, what we might refer to as the sort of specificities of Brazil in its more than human environments and so forth. I also wanted it to include questions of engagement with particular environmental themes, environmental concerns, with questions of, say, environmental transformation, rural to urban migration, deforestation.
So it's as much about the environment as what we think about the environment.
Exactly.
That's what you're...
Exactly. So this last sort of point there that I wanted to sort of get to with this notion was that I wanted to allow for what I was finding in this work, which was a level of sort of abstract, sort of philosophical thinking, in which they're thinking about the environment, or they're thinking about nature as sort of categories of perception, categories of meaning, and so they're really engaging with the environment in very sort of abstract philosophical ways. You know, what do we mean?
Right, not just the specific environment,
exactly,
but the idea of what the environment is and how we relate to it.
Right. And this is the image that I chose for the cover. This is a sort of composite landscape by a contemporary Brazilian artist named Eduardo Coimbra, who I think that there's something recognizable here about this seems to be a particularly Brazilian land, but at the same time it's abstracted in a way. It's a way that it's abstract in a way that I think evokes notions of globality in a sense.
Right.
And so that's kind of what I was
Earth-like,
getting at.
planet-like.
Right. And so I wanted to get a sense of how they're pushing beyond the specificities of say Brazil as an environmental location to think more sort of globally, abstractly about environmental.
That's great. I mean, that does it.
Brazil is always a rich site to investigate just about anything that anyone can imagine. But so there's that. You know, being a Brazilianist and bringing these concerns somewhere. I mean, that's where obviously I went with it. But there are, you know, certainly very interesting things that Brazil brings to the table, I would say. There's the country's scale, sort of continental scale. Its diversity, both in terms of biodiversity, sort of biome diversity, and also cultural diversity. There's I would say a global consequentiality to the way in which environmental change and crisis is perceived and responded to in Brazil. If we think about whether the Amazon is going to remain a sort of carbon sink, or if it's going to be converted into a source of carbon emissions. If we think about that Brazil's just really tremendous biodiversity, it's estimated to have about 20% of the identified plant species on Earth. The Amazon puts 20%. It accounts for 20% of the fresh water that's just discharged into the oceans, and so it's really consequential, I think, in terms of what you know, how Brazilians perceive their environment and how they respond to environmental change. It's consequential globally, absolutely. There's another interesting thing that I think Brazil brings to the table, which is a really long history of being identified with sort of Edenic representations of this exotic and abundant nature, and then as a sort of counterpoint to that, there is also a long-running discourse of Brazil as this is sort of counterpoint between between identifying Brazil as a place of natural sort of abundance, and the counterpoint of that is the discourse of its loss, ultimately. And so we can find at the same time these representations of Brazilian abundance back to the sort of birth certificate of Brazil, which is the letter back to the king of Portugal and its discovery, in which the land is described in very effusive terms. It's very beautiful, it's very lush, and whatever one were to plant in this land would flourish. But then shortly after that, there are already those writing to denounce the sort of despoilment of the land and natural resources in Brazil. So there's this long sort of counterpoint between abundance and destruction from the 16th century onward. And so I think that there's that in the background that contemporary artists and writers and environmental thinkers can sort of draw from and respond to. And a lot of time on this. This is a sort of theoretical, I guess, component to the book. How do we differentiate, say, eco-poetry from nature poetry? And there are interesting conversations going on about that. Or how do we differentiate what is coming to be described as, say, earth art or eco art from other artistic modes of representation of nature, so say landscape painting and stuff.
Right.
And so, I think there are obviously sort of blurred lines. They're not sharp distinctions. I think there's a sort of continuity. But I'd say that what I see, and this can perhaps be better explored through some specific examples of texts by the artists and poets that I'm working on, but that there's a sort of reflexivity about form. There's a sort of skepticism regarding representational forms. There's an acknowledgement of I guess, the distance between the word and the thing, and so there's always that highlighting, I guess, of the limits of our ability to represent I guess the non-human other, the more than human world. So there's that.
In both
there's that sort of edge in both.
Yeah,
and that's what I see as sort of the bridge between the two of them. I see them ultimately as very very closely aligned, I would say, conceptually.
Two of the artists that you talk about, Frans Krajcberg and Fonteles, Bené, Fonteles. They're both artists and they're both environmental activists. And they, as you put it, they both work to unsettle boundaries between the artist, the art object, and social and natural environments to address this very subject. So can you talk a bit about them and what they do and how they differ from each other, because they're very different in their approaches, and how they, in their art and in their environmental goals?
I think that they are aligned and sort of allied in many ways in their approach to sort of bridging art and environmental activism. Krajcberg sort of comes to this kind of indirectly in some ways. He originally just started working with sort of nature as a source of material and as a source of sort of new sort of avant-garde forms, I guess. So if we look at what he's doing with these natural elements here, integrating them, but also still maintaining the frame as a formal reference. Here he's doing relief of wave patterns on the sand and so forth. But he became very attuned later on to, here actually he works with natural mineral tints, very sort of site-specific work in terms of where he's drawing his materials from. But he claims there's a sort of moment in which he claims a sort of conversion to an environmental awareness by the early 1970s, and so he becomes very engaged in documenting the destruction of Brazil's forests, both in the Amazon, where he embarks on a couple of different expeditions. Originally, he was going there to get materials for his work, and he began to become sort of aware of the destruction that was happening and started to document this. And so that's really became the direction his work took in, or the direction which he went with his bringing back and burned materials. And he would create sculptures out of these and then display these publicly as a sort of.
So these are all
visible.
trees that have
These
been
are
burned.
all trees that have been burned
Okay.
that he brought back from different parts of Brazil. He claimed that he no longer considered what he was doing to be art, but that it was simply a sort of a gesture of protest or denunciation. Really, like the way to distinguish him from Fonteles, I would say, is that his is very much a sort of it's an activism, and it's an art that's very much oriented towards a sort of wilderness ethics and aesthetics. So it's about. I mean, he's interested in the forest. Fonteles is really interested. He's interested in conservation issues in that sense of, say, conservation of landscapes, of ecosystems, of forests, and so forth. But he's also very interested in what we might describe as endangered socio-biodiversity in Brazil. So really, he's interested in bringing attention to and working from what he describes as Afro-Indigenous mestizo communities in Brazil's sort of rural periphery, sort of on the edges of development that are threatened by development projects. And so his work always tends to mix or blend these sort of natural elements. So again, like Krajcberg, sort of wood is a big element. Stone as well. The Krajcberg also works with sort of integrated with wood, but also these sort of artifacts of the local material cultures that he sees as sort of threatened, but that emerge from these specific sort of environmental conditions or these specific places.
What, the Brazilian Last Supper?
Brazil's Brazilian Last Supper, and so just to go over some of the elements in here, he's got sort of handcrafted stools with wood and cowhide, stones, clay pots, clay figurines, I guess they're bottles on the edges.
Yeah.
Those have seeds in them. They have dirt from different locations in Brazil. They tend to be sort of composites, not always, but they tend to be sort of composites of references to different material cultures from around different parts of Brazil that he kind of brings together in a sort of montage. He's worked on a number of different issues in terms of kind of social or environmental justice issues, both in terms of indigenous land claims, making sure that they're positioned as protagonists in conservation efforts. He centers his activism all over Brazil, ultimately, and it's not really centered on one particular region or one particular, I guess ethnic paradigm, but really responding to what he sees as a variety of local material cultures that are.
So he blends the social and the non-human other.
Exactly.
What you're talking. One of the poets that Malcolm wrote about died he was 97, I believe. Manoel de Barros. And his work is rooted in Brazil's Pantanal. And you say he establishes, I love this, a radical intimacy with other orders of beings. Can you elaborate on that? I also like what you say about how his work broke down walls between our world and the natural world. How does he go about that? And where, for anybody who doesn't know, and what is the Pantanal?
Right. So the Pantanal is considered one of Brazil's major biomes. It's over here in the central west, where Brazil borders with Bolivia and Paraguay. And it's basically just a really large sort of, tropical wetlands networks, something I guess akin to the Everglades, just on a much larger scale. And it's actually in a pretty decent state of conservation. We don't know what will happen in terms of climate change. That could change things dramatically, obviously. But the estimates that I've seen are that it's about 80% in a state of good conservation. So it's a place. This is one of the terms that I really like from some of my readings in eco-criticism, but it's a great place to go see charismatic megafauna. Barros doesn't look at these things in his poetry. He tends to sort of look at the ground. He's looking at sort of abject things like snails and worms and rust and mud and sort of ruins of houses and tin cans and these sorts of things. And I think that there's a couple of points about his work that I think are really interesting. But in terms of that sort of radical intimacy with the other, I think it's this desire to sort of eliminate the distance between the self and the non-human other, and so to really sort of try to take the perspective of the other. And for Barros, essentially, this sort of personifying imagination personification is the way to know what one wants to know, right? And there's this sort of shift of perspective constantly. There's also this gaze upon things in which they're always sort of changing from one state to another, or even from one order of being to another. And so it sort of evokes this idea that everything is here in this kind of muck, this primordial muck, and everything is sort of changing from one thing to the other out of this kind of shared materiality and sort of condition of kind of emergence, death,
Earth, death, decay, house, right? Like going back to his old house. That's becoming part of nature, and his memories are being taken over too, and it's all being recycled, and we are woven into that.
But the other aspect to it, and this is something that I kind of realized after I had already written this about him, and I'd gotten to another poet, was that his work is very much informed by it seems to me by an Amerindian mythopoetics that involves essentially a kind of philosophy of nature, in which there isn't this sharp distinction between one order of being and another.